And as America observes a very solemn anniversary of 9/11 today, the question of national security is the most prominent concern. The ouster of National Security Advisor John Bolton brought unusual bipartisan cheers, but also concern about the turmoil in this Trump administration. The National Security Advisor chairs the National Security Council and distills ideas and options for the president, and a list of the emerging who could possibly place Bolton. The names floated so far include Major General Ricky Waddell, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor early in the administration, Brian Hook, the U.S. Special Representative for Iran and Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State, retired General Keith Kellogg, who served as Acting National Security Advisor after Michael Flynn's firing. He is currently Vice President Pence's National Security Advisor. Former Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert and Ambassador to Germany Richard Grenell. Joining me now, NBC News correspondent Courtney Kube, White House correspondent for the New York Times Annie Karni, and Politico White House reporter Nancy Cook. Courtney, you've got some exclusive reporting on the deteriorating relationship between the president and John Bolton, and what I believe is quite a surprise with who the president reached out to in terms of H.R. McMaster, the last one who had the job.
That's right, Steph. So it was surprising given the way that President Trump very unceremoniously fired H.R. McMaster, his second national security advisor last year, via Twitter, and had already offered the job to John Bolton, who he then fired unceremoniously once again via Twitter yesterday. But we found out, my colleague Carol Lee and Kristen Welker and I found out that only several months after Bolton started in the job, President Trump had started reaching out to H.R. McMaster, telling him that he missed him, according to a number of senior administration officials. And then he reached out to him other times, asking him for advice on things like the conflict and the tensions with Iran, and even asking him who should be his next Secretary of Defense, Stephanie.
Annie, the president just talked about Bolton's firing, saying that the former national security advisor just was not getting along with important people in the administration. Now that he's gone, what are the feelings inside the White House? Because for months, President Trump said it was good that John Bolton sort of had a different opinion as the president. But alas, that didn't work out.
That didn't work out. And the feeling in the white of the remaining aides, we saw it on the faces of the Secretary of State Pompeo and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin yesterday in the briefing room. Big smiles. This has been a tension between Pompeo and Bolton as to who is the top dog in terms of foreign policy advice being given to the president, and the Pompeo side of the aisle won. So there's a lot of relief that Bolton is gone, but there's concern that Bolton was a character in this White House who was not afraid to disagree with the president, who pushed back, who his people are getting out there saying, his legacy is saving Trump from 3 potentially disastrous deals that he could have gotten into without Bolton pushing back hard. And this is someone really at the end of his career who didn't have much to lose and wasn't looking to maneuver to something higher. And now he's gone. So that's another check in the White House against some of Trump's instincts that's no longer there.
So, Annie, are people inside the White House glad he's gone?
Yeah, there was actually a scene that played out outside of the briefing room yesterday in front of Stephanie Grisham, the press secretary's office, where she was walking back to her office, and a Bolton advisor was speaking to reporters there and telling them, again, this line of, he saved this administration from bad deals. And Stephanie Grisham sort of smiled and said, I don't know what bad deals even means. It sounds like they're trying to make him sound good on his way out. So clearly you're in the same White House, you're talking to administration officials, and one of them is sort of snarking on the way the other one is spinning this departure. So yes, there's tension, and the one who was causing all the tension is now gone.
Snarking, that's definitely tense. Courtney, here's something that stuck out to many of us. The president referenced Bolton's Libya model comment, but that was regarding North Korea and his position on Venezuela when he was talking about why Bolton was fired or why he left. But here's the thing. Those issues happened months, if not a year ago.
Right. It was months ago. So, I mean, it sounds as if there was a series of foreign policy, national security issues that John Bolton just had a different view on than President Trump. And the reality is, you know, as a national security advisor, you can make the decision to pursue your own policy agenda or to take what the president wants and pursue that. And it just became more and more apparent that John Bolton was really pursuing his own national security and foreign policy agenda and policies that he was trying to enact, as opposed to the ones that President Trump wanted. What my colleagues and I reported on yesterday was that the final straw was this whole Camp David meeting over the weekend that President Trump tweeted about. He said that there was supposed to be a meeting between the Taliban, the United States, and the Afghan government, the Ghani government, and that it was canceled at the last minute, that President Trump called it off because of this horrible attack, suicide attack in Kabul last week that killed an American and a NATO soldier. Well, it came out later that after the meeting was canceled, that in fact John Bolton was against the idea. That was widely reported, and John Bolton never disputed those reports. And that, according to a number of officials who we spoke to, was really the last straw. The president was angry. He saw John Bolton as leaking those stories, and he was angry that he didn't dispute the notion that they were at odds on the idea of this meeting.
All right, Nancy, let's talk about who's going to potentially get the job. We've got Ricky Waddell, Brian Hook, Keith Kellogg, Tom Bossert, and Richard Grenell. Who do you think has the best shot, and who is the most closely aligned with the president's ideology?
Well, I think one person that has a good shot is actually Brian Hook, and it's mostly because he is at the State Department and he is a Pompeo aide. You know, Secretary Pompeo is one of the most influential people in the Trump orbit at this point. I would argue probably the most influential cabinet member. And what I see happening and playing out over the next several weeks will be sort of a proxy battle to see who can take over this slot. You know, I think Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, has a national security advisor he'd love to stick in that slot. Pompeo would love to stick Brian Hook in there. You know, Richard Grenell is close to the president's son, Don Jr. And so it's really going to be sort of a fight among people to put their person in that slot. But I would put my money on Pompeo and Brian Hook just because Pompeo has been so adept at working with the president, managing the president, and sort of managing the infighting in the White House at this point. And I think he will have a key say in whoever gets that position.
Nancy, he's also a very close ally of Jared Kushner. On all of Jared's international trips, Brian is with him. Is having the support of Jared a huge positive?
Absolutely. And we've seen that play out time and time again in the Trump orbit. Brad Parscale, the campaign manager, for instance, is very close to Jared and has made sure to cultivate that relationship. And I think at this point, the people who are close to Jared are the ones who are succeeding in the campaign in the White House. And people who had friction with Jared before, like Rex Tillerson or the former White House attorney Don McGahn or General John Kelly, those people have all left at this point. I think wooing the kids and having their support is a key part of succeeding in the Trump White House.
All right, Courtney, Kube, Annie Karni, Nancy Cook. Nothing makes my day more positive when three smart women help us get a little smarter. Now I want to bring in another extraordinary woman, my friend Jane Harman, president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jane, what is your take on John Bolton's departure?
Well, let me say first, Stephanie, speaking of bright women, you are certainly one, and kudos to you for speaking out on the Forbes matter.
Thank you.
But it is 9/11, and let's remember that of the important things we should talk about today, we should talk about what happened 18 years ago and the resilience of our country. Hasn't been perfect, but no major catastrophic attack since, thanks to the work of a lot of people and 3 different administrations. On the Bolton thing, in some strange way, my reaction is everybody knew who he was when he came. Everybody knew he was an ideologue and hard to work with. And guess what? He was an ideologue and hard to work with. Surprise. But my comment going forward is I almost don't think it matters who's in the job. I think what matters is whether that person will be permitted to restore a process where the best in the government and outside the government can comment and thoughtfully consider future action, and then the president will listen at least to their recommendations regardless of what he decides to do. I think there's been no process for a long time, and the absence of process, it seems to me, has caused us a lot of worry around the world. And just on the Iran thing, which I know you were discussing, my own comment is if we had a better process, I think perhaps the president would have done what a majority of Congress wanted, majority on both sides, and regardless of what they thought in the first place, he would have stayed in the deal, the JCPOA, and then he would have worked to make it stronger. I predict that had he done that, if he'd had Europe plus Russia and China and us pulling in the same direction, it would be stronger by now, and that would have been a great victory lap for him.
Do you think the American people think that much about the president? And, you know, some call it a revolving door with the amount of national security advisors he's had. You've just articulated why it's unsettling to you. But to the average American who looks at today and says, it has been 18 years and we haven't had a 9/11 since then, maybe the president is doing good enough.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of people to be congratulated for that. That's why I started with that. And I think this is a sacred day, and we need to honor the sacrifice of so many and the amount of treasure that was spent and the sacrifice of our allies and the brave people who were still there risking their lives, both the military folks and diplomatic folks, but also the paramilitary folks, the intelligence community assets that I think are so talented. So I think people look at that and possibly think that way, but I think most people focus on what the here and now, and they see some chaos, obviously, in the White House, and they worry about the economy and the economic indicators. And to a large extent, it's the economy, stupid, and that was the old mantra. I know you know this. And I think that will affect enormously what happens as this endless election season progresses.
All right, Jane, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.